Alrighty. Welcome everybody to NRhythm's Introduction to Regenerative Organizations webinar. Thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Riley Thomas and I'm a member of the NRhythm team. I'm the marketing coordinator. Today we're going to be introducing you to regenerative organizations. For those of you who are already familiar with some of this, we'll also be talking more about NRhythm's philosophy and framing behind it. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, NRhythm is a design management firm focused on revealing potential in people and in organizations. We work with networks, communities, organizations, and individuals offering a range of support from one-on-one coaching, operational design, and management support to many do-it-yourself tools, workbooks, and online courses that can help within your context. Many of these are free, like this webinar, and they can help you begin to make those shifts in mindsets and behaviors that are the foundation for adopting a regenerative approach to work and in your life. I will be posting some of these things in the chat about our tools during our time together, so keep a lookout on that. We would love to hear from you throughout the presentation. You can leave any questions, comments you have in the chat, and we will get around to any of those questions, anything that resonated with you at the end of the presentation in our little Q&A session. Thank you all again for being here, and I will turn it over to Trey.
Welcome, everyone. I am here primarily to thank you for being here and then to pass it along. If you've met me before or heard me before, this is not normally how I sound. So I have I've lost my voice, and but those who were coming to hear me talk about regenerative organizations, I just wanted to say my apologies. But I'm going to pass it along to Ryan, who is also one of our team members at NRhythm, and actually was one of the few people early in the process of the development of regenerative organizations that I had the pleasure of spending time with, and have great confidence in his ability to share and communicate kind of the essence of the work that we're doing. And so I will hang here and will be available for answering questions later, or if not needed, just listening in. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Ryan. Thanks for covering me, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Trey, and thanks for being here, even with the voice being out today. I'll go ahead and share my screen with you all and begin here. So thank you for joining this webinar on the introduction to regenerative organizations. Ultimately, when we are talking about introducing to regenerative organizations, we are asking you, in essence, to begin reimagining your own workspace. And sorry about that. So as Trey mentioned, I am an organizational design consultant here. And as we are thinking about this today, as we look at this and we begin walking through it, I am going to encourage you just to be thinking about this overall conversation because it's an imaginative experience as kind of a walk together. Today, as we are going along this path together, often when we talk about walking along somewhere or thinking about something together, we think of things in the West typically as journeys. We start in one space, A, and we want to get to B, very linear approach. Today, I really want you to think about it more from an Eastern context of like going on a pilgrimage. That is, you kind of leave your space, what you know, what you've always known, and you go and you explore something entirely new. And when you experience that, you don't just stay there or move on from there to something else. You take it back to your community, to your space, to your workplace, and begin thinking, how can what I've experienced influence that? So today, as we are going through this, I hope you are able to just reimagine your workspace, assess your relationship to work, and are intrigued by a living systems approach. and are inspired to weave it into your work. Later on, I also hope that you are able to contribute to just kind of those conversations. So why would we need to reimagine a workplace? I apologize. I was called in to do this kind of quickly, and I am not seeing my notes. So if you don't understand why I'm pausing so much, I apologize. So there hasn't been in recent times, there has been a lot of people who have been very dissatisfied with work. We know that from last year's statistics from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, over 47 million Americans voluntarily quit their jobs. It's an extraordinary amount to think about, and really begin thinking about why we would even want to rethink the workspace. This has an awful lot to do with it. And while we can say, last year was pretty extraordinary, things that have been going on in the world are pretty extraordinary, how the pandemic may have affected these things. The reality is that these sorts of things have been happening for quite a long time. We know that the number of engaged employees and actively disengaged employees for over 20 years, those numbers have been pretty understandably underwhelming. And even for our own selves, when we think about our workspace, why we might want to reimagine it, it's probably because if you're anything like me, you've been tempted at one time or another to say something like this, that this work would be great if it weren't for the people. I know I have heard that, I have thought that before. Or conversely, maybe you absolutely love the people you're working with, your team, but you recognize that the work or the way you're going about the work is rather toxic. When we say these things, it's an acknowledgement that there is something about the work environment that is just draining the life out of us. And it's really important that we rethink our workspace and how we go about work, because as Annie Dillard said, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. Ultimately, the best reason to reimagine this is because we spend a massive chunk of our lives at work. And we would like to know that it is making a difference in the world, that it is contributing to the communities around us. Have you ever considered how much time you actually spend at work? I'll go ahead and let you just think about that for a second. Just kind of log it in your mind. What percentage of your life do you think you're at work? It is estimated that we spend over 90,000 hours, or 1/3 of our lives, at work. If you consider the fact that we spend another third of our lives sleeping, that means that over half of our lives, or roughly half of our lives, is spent working. So when we think about the impact of thinking of work in a way that is exhausting, draining, toxic, it really begins to inspire us to think, how can we redesign this? How can we reimagine it? Because I don't want to spend half of my life in an environment that's draining, or just accept that it has to be toxic. But how did we get here? Ultimately, we got here because it was designed this way. The kinds of things that we are experiencing in work environments today are by design. And that doesn't mean that the design started off with these desired outputs, but these consequences are in fact consequences of the design itself. Our traditional approach to workplace design may have served well for a time, but it's draining the life out of people because the common design of the workplace has typically been delivered in a way that is answering questions that are the wrong questions to begin with. We've designed with the wrong questions in mind. When I say the wrong questions, what I mean is that from the very get-go, we are not in agreement on what sort of things we're designing work around. We often design our work situations to answer complicated situations. In complicated situations, we have inputs with a series of known steps, and we can predict and control the outcomes or the outputs of those. Complicated problems can be hard to solve, but they are addressable with rules and recipes or a series of steps. When you think of complicated systems, you might be thinking of things like engines or computers or software. But that's not really what often our workspaces actually look like. They look a lot more like complex situations, which have dense interdependencies, and there is non-linear change, and things become quickly unpredictable in a complex environment. In complicated environments, we are always looking to build something or have particular outputs. So if you are assembling something or you are using something to fix something or program something, then you're facing a complicated situation and you can have complicated solutions. But if you're trying to do something like coach a championship basketball team or raise your kids or lead an organization, you are facing a complex challenge, one that needs to be managed. Thinking about just how we got to thinking of work as something that needs to be solved for in a complicated way, here's just a quick history of how we kind of got to this approach. Newton and other great thinkers made breakthroughs in science and provided a paradigm characterized by rationalism, logic, cause and effect, and prediction and control. And this informed the philosophical foundation for much of our Western civilization. Newton's laws were so convincing that for over 300 years, we began applying these principles to science, and in a reductionist and mechanistic approach, we also began applying these principles to every aspect of human endeavor, including business. In the industrial age, there was a major shift towards this mechanical approach, and business leaders wanted to be able to invest certain inputs through a series of very carefully defined steps that would deliver the predictable outcomes that they wanted to achieve. And on the face of it, that sounds great. It sounds an awful lot like maybe an assembly line. But the reality is our businesses, our organizations aren't just assembly lines that can produce or mass produce things. They are in fact all of the people that interact around those tools. Many great thinkers have realized the limitations of this mechanistic approach. We see here a quote from Albert Einstein: "When the number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, scientific method in most cases fails. One need only think of the weather, in which case the prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible." A mechanistic view doesn't work in addressing every challenge we face, because every challenge we face isn't complicated. Many are complex. So again, when we start with the right questions, when we start thinking about businesses and organizations, from the very get-go, we have to decide what sort of thing it is we're designing. And that brings up pictures in our mind. When we think about the overall picture that we tend to use for work, the overall metaphor we tend to use for work, we tend to revolve around a pretty dominant one. And it comes across in statements like, we want this thing working like a well-oiled machine, or I don't have the bandwidth for that, or we've got to dial that in. We want to move the needle, or we need to hit the reset button. All of these statements are used because the dominant picture that we often think of, the dominant metaphor we often use, are machines. And really, we need to start with a better picture, because while machines are excellent tools in getting complicated solutions solved for, they do not account for the complexity of life. Often when we think of metaphors, we don't give them the power that we don't think that they have the power that they actually have in our lives. Far too often, the pictures that we have are driving our ideas, our worldviews on things. And in the end, it changes the way that we operate and design. When we think of organizations as a machine, it has the same consequence as if we had designed the entire thing to solve complicated situations. So we believe our design needs life. We need to begin designing with something that can account for the complexity of the organizations we work in. And this is why within Rhythm, we like to use the metaphor of living systems. And we don't just think of this as a cute picture that we can paint our designs over, but that it actually informs, drives all of the thinking and principles and design work we do, along with all of our organizing and frameworks to get that work done. When we say that we're designing around life, that can get kind of complicated itself or complex. Because when we think about it, we have to answer this question: what are the essential characteristics of life? What is life? When we just ask that question, it opens up a world of issues. Because the reality is, when we ask the question, what is life? We are jumping into a question that people from all backgrounds, scientists from all sorts of backgrounds, have been questioning for a very long time, whether that's biologists or chemists, computer scientists, philosophers, astrobiologists, engineers, theologians, social scientists, ecologists. All of them have tried to put some definition around life. Here at In Rhythm, we really appreciate the work of Fritjof Capra and Pierluigi Luisi, whose book, The Living Systems View of Life, has really guided what we tend to look at when we say we want to design around life. In their book, they point to the conceptual idea of autopoiesis. And this is an idea that was developed by Umberto Maturana and Francisca Varela, two Chilean biologists whose school is often referred to as the Santiago School. Both of these scientists are famous mostly for this theory of autopoiesis, which responds to that general question of what is life? And what's significant about their work is that through multiple experiences and studies in biological cells, they were able to identify and reproduce individual living attributes. But those weren't in and of themselves life. What was living was the interconnections between those attributes. So life wasn't the collection of all those individual attributes, but rather the whole living system. And this discovery led them to coin the term autopoiesis. Auto meaning self, and refers to things like autonomy or self-organizing. And poiesis means, it comes from the same Greek word, it has a root word as poetry. So when we say autopoiesis, it's literally self-making, or self-poetry. So this systems view of life, when we talk about a systems view of life, it's helpful because when we're looking for what is essential in life, we aren't just looking to one singular expression of life. We're not saying that we need to design organizations around the idea of a horse or a tree, but rather we are looking to what is essential in an entire living system, all of its interconnectedness. With those ideas in mind, and that understanding of biological cells and autopoiesis, living systems, we have come to rely on this definition of life, and it guides us in all of kind of our designs in organizations. Life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So if this is true, if life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making, then living systems are of themselves regenerative. They are self-making. So regeneration then, I know that it's a term that's being used quite a bit nowadays, but regeneration then doesn't become an adjective for life. It is rather synonymous with life. When we talk about living systems and what is living about them, we are talking about regeneration itself. We're talking about self-poetry, self-making. That's really important to think about when we talk about designing around the idea of living systems design. If we use this as our metaphor then, and we think about, well, then what is an organization? We can then begin to define and design around this idea. For us here at In Rhythm, we would define an organization this way. An organization is a living system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making, where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. Read that again. An organization is a living system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making, where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. This definition is very helpful when we are thinking about reimagining workspaces, but it looks even better if we would say contrast it to what if we would have designed it around a machine approach or machine design. Looking at the definition we have for organizations and giving contrast to what it might be if we designed it around a definition where we used machine as a metaphor. The machine design metaphor leads us to a definition of an organization as a structure that uses power to apply force and control movement to perform an intended action. So in the same way that the entire industrial design, the entire mechanistic design, was used to get certain outputs from certain inputs and series of steps, that's how we see many organizations running today. This definition on the right of a structure that uses power to apply force and control movement to perform an intended action is a definition of an organization that I'd say is very familiar to me, and it might be familiar to you. Most of the organizations I have worked in are doing exactly this, trying to use power and force to deliver intended actions. And in and of itself, it's not a terrible thing, but it has incredible consequences on the people who work in those organizations. And so we might say, hey, these metaphors aren't a big deal, but the reality is the way we design and what we design around has incredible consequences. And not just in our intention, but also in how we operate. If we are to use machines as our beginning point, our beginning design, then we begin to see that in the design itself of how an organization operates or what it intends to do, within mechanistic design, we see that it seeks to engineer best practices. And that doesn't sound very bad. I mean, we all think best practices are amazing. We often think, hey, running into a problem, what's other people's solutions to that? Wikipedia defines a best practice as a method or a technique that has been generally accepted as superior to any alternative because it produces results that is superior to those achieved by other means, or because it has become a standard way of doing things. That sounds like a pretty good approach. But best practices don't handle the dense interdependencies or the nonlinear change or quickly unpredictable environments of complex challenges very well. On the other hand, if you're looking at kind of this green triangle on top, if on the other hand, we begin with a living systems design in mind, well, then living systems, they inform principles. What's the difference between principles and practices? Principles really speaks to our beliefs or our postures towards something. Best practices are specific things that you are supposed to do in a challenge, but principles speak to who you want to be and how you approach those challenges. And in this way, principles are a great fit for rapidly changing environments because they don't tell you exactly what you're supposed to do. They inform the way in which you might do it. With that in mind and thinking about living systems, here at In Rhythm, we have for ourselves really identified 6 principles or patterns from living systems that helps us think through how we design every aspect of work and our own lives. These design principles guide our design decisions and day-to-day management of organizations. And we see here's 3 of them that we'll begin with. The first one we look at is the principle of holism. That is that the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that principle, that way of thinking, helps us design and operate in a way that values the entirety of the system and creates conditions for abundance, resilience, and impact to emerge from the interdependent contributions of all team members, clients, and partners. We also see the principle of interdependence. That is just kind of that inherent value of all relationships in a system. And that causes us to design and operate in a way that recognizes the complexity of our deep interdependence with our clients, our suppliers, our partners, and even our competitors. We see the principle of uniqueness, this idea of originality and the possibility of individual genius. And that principle helps us design and operate in a way that fosters the expression of the genius of all members within the greater context and purpose of our organization. These principles on the face of them, we'd say, oh, this is just another trite expression or way of looking at business. But I want you to really think for a second before we move on. Looking at these three principles, and if they aren't best practices, they aren't exactly how you're supposed to do things. If they are how you begin to approach work, what about your current work environment changes if you are operating, designing with the principle of holism, interdependence, and uniqueness in mind? Holism, approaching each challenge with a view of how it affects the entire system and not just interacts with different departments, particular projects. What if you always were keeping the whole in mind as you were operating? What if you really believed in the principle of interdependence and were approaching each challenge with an appreciation for every relationship that your organization has, even its relationships with its competitors? Would it change anything, the way you designed it or the way you operate? If you really were thinking about the principle of uniqueness, approaching each challenge with the power of the unleashed potential that the individual qualities and uniqueness of each team member bring to the context, we would see organizations that are designed and operating in a way that are really fostering the opportunity for each team member and not just select team members to contribute and bring new ideas to the surface. The other three principles that we see in living systems and that we design around, one is evolutionary, and that principle really is just this idea of maintaining a dynamic balance with this ever-changing environment. And thinking about the principle of evolutionary, it causes us to design and operate in a way that both responds to and creates change in our organizational environment to maintain a dynamic balance with constant change. We see the principle of nodal, that is decentralized and distributed power. That causes us to design and operate in a way that does not rely on centralized command and control structures and allows all members of the system to be resourced, empowered decision makers. We see the principle of developmental, that is the growth and health of all members. And that causes us to design in a way that creates the conditions for all members to grow and thrive in conjunction with the health of the system. So again, if we take these principles and we begin thinking, we begin imagining how our work environments would be different if these principles were in play, we begin to see that things might be very different if we were approaching every challenge through an evolutionary principle and the assurance that each response to every challenge, favorable or unfavorable, only informs or creates future responses. Or with nodal, approaching challenges with direct connection and support from team members without having to wait for permission to act or knowing that you have the authority and responsibility to self-organize and respond. Or developmental, approaching every challenge, not just with a focus on how to meet, but to do so with intention of being and learning a growth opportunity for every team member. We believe that these principles in designing and operating this way in response to these challenges are in and of themselves regenerative. They are a representation of the living systems. I like this quote from Buckminster Fuller: "Work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help." When we use these principles as our guide, we not only begin to reimagine, but we also begin to think about how we cooperate with life itself and how we are able to redesign and reoperate. Going back to kind of the difference between living systems design and machine design, we see again that in machine design, they seek to engineer best practices, and then those best practices are intended to enforce prescriptive structures. But in a living systems design, we see that it informs those principles that we were talking about, that we look and see from living systems those principles. And what do those principles do? They then begin to facilitate flexible frameworks. So whereas the principles begin to help us rethink and redesign, they begin to inform then a framework which helps us to reorganize. Like many design agencies, we facilitate in helping organizations think through frameworks for work, how they're going to design their work to get done. One thing that really sets apart in Rhythm's regenerative framework is this look and emphasis on organizational health. Like other agencies, we may help someone look at their context, which it often comes out in words like mission or vision for other organizations. But when we think about an organizational context, we're really talking about trying to identify, getting to the identity of an organization. So we talk about things like its shared purpose. Why have we all come together? And really, if thinking about it as a living system itself, thinking about its existence. So when we talk about shared purpose, we challenge people to think about it in this way, that we exist to blank, in a way that blank, so that blank. And by thinking of it that way, we begin to create an organizational identity, not just a mission or a vision, but actually a sense of identity of who we are and what things we are going to do together in the world. When we talk about organizational context, we also think about the ways we are behaving with one another and the sorts of behaviors that are going to be necessary for us to work together toward that common purpose. We talk about quality of life, how we want our lives to be lived, because we aren't just cogs in a machine trying to get certain outputs. We are living systems in cooperation. We talk about our supporting environment, because we really do believe in those interdependencies of our network connections. And we think about all of this through an equity lens. In that way, when we begin kind of with a context instead of a mission or purpose, we aren't just saying that we're a machine that has to be constructed for a certain outcome. We are saying that we are a living system that has come together. We are living beings that have come together for a shared purpose, and there are ways of interacting that will help us get there. When we think about how those principles might also inform our framework and how we get work done, this causes us also then to look to organizational health as central to really our ability to fulfill that purpose. We see organizational health as essential, the essential thing to our ability to see the fulfillment of our purpose. It is actually kind of the work that we are doing. In a machine design, we might be always looking to the outcomes and to improve those outcomes. But in a living systems design, we're constantly looking and monitoring health. Because when we are healthy, then we are able to see the abundance that comes from our purpose. When we think about organizational health, we think about it in really 4 categories or 4 areas. One is just energy flow. We can think about this as thriving members. Why in the world would anyone want to show up to work? What is causing people to not feel fulfilled in their work? These are the sorts of questions and things we are looking at when we monitor and look to organizational health through the lens of energy flow. We look at information cycle. That is, how are we making intelligent decisions and recognizing that every aspect of our business goes through the same life cycles of living systems. That is, everything in your organization goes through a series of birth, of growth, of decay, of death and decay. And while often organizations may focus in on well, the kinds of things that we want to do or the new things that we want to be getting done, often there isn't enough time spent on, well, what is dying? What is needing to stop? And what can we learn from that? How can it inform what comes next? When we talk about organizational health, we're thinking about communication cycle and how we are evaluating and integrating and evolving all of the information that goes on in an organization. And we're thinking about the diversity of our network connections and how they contribute to the health of our entire system. As with any other framework, we think then about the structures of how we enable that health and how we build a platform for growth. We think through the kinds of things that come, the work that's necessary to see the fulfillment of our context. And ultimately, we look to the abundance that comes if we are able to finally see it come all together. We believe that in a living systems design, that as it is informing those principles and we are using that flexible framework, and then it actually helps us regenerate, not just get to an outcome, not just see certain things accomplished, but that those things actually inform what happens next. And so in a living systems design, we see that really it begins maintaining itself. It's creating conditions for more life and work to be accomplished. I've said a lot of words and admittedly, probably a little choppy, but we've really gotten to a point here where I'm hoping that we are able to have a conversation. My hope today is that in some way I've represented the work of Rhythm well, but I hope it's really brought up a lot of questions for you as you've reimagined your workspace, your relationship to work. I'm hoping that you've been exposed to or thinking in terms of living systems approach, and that you have some desire to begin weaving that into your work. But really the thing that I'm most excited about right now is just our opportunity to begin asking questions or sharing things that have come up for you as you've been thinking about that. So Riley, I'll just kind of turn it over to you to see if there's any questions that come up in our chat and open it up to everyone who's been listening.
Thank you, Ryan, for your fantastic presentation. I didn't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to open it up to anybody right now. If anything's come to mind, anything that they want to share, any questions that they have. This is also a great opportunity too, if you're able to turn on your camera so we can see your beautiful faces and have a good conversation too.
Can I ask one question? I have one question related to like when we have like a system which is like running like a machine, and we transfer it into like a regenerative process. So where should we like start making changes, like big changes? From which point?
Yeah, so for us, when we look at kind of the framework, although the picture itself was very linear, which would suggest kind of we begin in a particular place, aside from really being clear on our collective reason for coming together, the rest of it is interdependent, right? And so really when you talk about rethinking or where to begin, a lot of the things that come up most easily are we look and we say, well, where is health and where do we see it thriving, and where do we see things in our health that are not thriving? And that gives us a really good indicator of where we can begin imagining regeneration. So again, thinking about kind of those four areas of energy flow, information cycle, communication cycle, network connections. When we talk with organizations and we say, what are some of the biggest challenges you're seeing? we try to see them through those lenses and begin building structures to enable health around that.
Thank you for your answer.
See that Carol asked in the chat, would it be possible to have some examples of the regenerative principles applied to a company like Nodal, for example?
Yeah, so currently we work with several organizations, and one of the most powerful ways we've seen a change in the principle being applied of Nodal is to an entire global network that had a centralized command and control structure. That is, it was very hierarchical in its approach. And even though it represented different regions from all over the world in their effort to advance their mission, all decisions were made through a centralized structure where those voices really were not being heard. And what you end up seeing in that kind of environment is people in specific spaces who are far from that command and control. They don't have opportunity to share how that mission may be best advanced in their own individual space. And so what we have done over the last couple of years is work with them to redesign their entire governance and their entire structure, to empower voices at those levels, to be part of decision-making process, and to be able to say, in this space over here, in line with our collective purpose, we want to be able to see these sorts of things happening. And it cooperates with the greater whole. It's part of the health of the system, but it isn't given a stamp of approval by the centralized command and control structure. It is, in fact, able to, through its own autonomy, begin making decisions for itself and cooperating with the whole system. Does that, Carol, does that answer your question, or would you like other examples?
She said yes. Thank you.
I would love to hear another example, maybe of a different principle being applied.
Well, let me think. Which is there a particular principle that interests you?
I think what I'm most curious about is, I mean, it makes sense if you're building a new company to kind of build it from the ground up in this manner. But I imagine the practice and process of actually transforming an organization from a machine model to a living model is really, I know there's nuance with complicated and complex here. I'm not sure which category it falls into, but we'll just put it at tough. So I'm curious about, I mean, I guess, you know, every organization maybe has its own unique scenarios. So just curious about it more at play and things that might come up when you're working with an organization to shift. And from my perspective, the foundation is always the most important. So that concept of the organizational context, you know, kind of building that up first to inform all the other things. But I guess, you know, if you're doing it in kind of a client scenario and the big issue is the communication, maybe you put out fires first. So yeah, curious about it in process as like a consultant kind of angle when you're coming in to help.
Yeah, and I have some examples for Trey. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Diane. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is creating some awareness around what would be different if we really look through those lenses. And really just try to create space for creativity and imagination versus implementation. And from a consultant, a kind of a mentor advisor, it really allows people to open up versus immediately tell us why it's not going to work. And that's been quite successful in engaging in that conversation. And so the principles are used as a way to see into something. And so we can go through, and Ryan, if you have some examples immediately, we can use the ones you're thinking about. But we can go through each one and go, yeah, what does HR look like if we were thinking through holism or through uniqueness or developmental, or we're thinking about project management? What does it look like if we're thinking through these different principles? And we really try to operationalize and land this in a real practical way, but start with the everything's on the table. What would it look like? And then begin to narrow that down. And one of the things that we've seen work in large organizations is piloting this with, it could be a project, it could be a particular department, it could be a particular idea that you are wanting to investigate or discover through these lenses. So that's how we use the principles as a way to kind of play with it, to see it versus it's very clear what it looks like when we go through this mechanistic design. So hopefully that's helpful. Ryan, you may have more to add.
Yeah, I think you brought up the language of putting out fires, right? And sometimes when there are, a client approaches us with sort of more immediate needs, I think first and foremost, just helping them to begin to see from a living systems perspective where those health concerns actually fit. And a lot of times they're coming across a more of a machine mindset of this is just a program or a product that needs to be adjusted, or we can just find somebody else. We can just get a new cog for this portion of the machine. But really begin to think through what is going on right now. Is it part of the energy flow of the company? Is it part of our information cycle? Is it part of our communication cycle? Or does it have to do with our network connections? And really first by identifying those things, and we have a process called our organizational health index that is actually how we kind of assess that for organizations. But that really draws out those answers of what areas of health are we addressing? And then that allows us to begin thinking about structures. And for me, that's really where those principles come into play, because those structures and then the design of the structures is how we begin addressing those health elements. So first we identify, well, what actually is going on, and we get agreement on whether or not that is, what area of health that is for the organization. And then we start saying, okay, if we were going to create a structure, now we can design it in a way that we are thinking about it in a holistic way, in a developmental way, honoring uniqueness, nodalism. And when we begin designing structures that way, at least it's been my experience, I think our experience is when we just introduce a little bit of health into an organization, that it really gives way to other health. And it gets easier to make healthier and healthier decisions the more we make simple, healthy decisions. So I don't know if that helps, but often it isn't, to your point, just we get to design it from the ground up, but often we do get to design the structures, the new structures to address health from the ground up.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that helps me understand a lot more. Thank you for those detailed answers. I have another curiosity, if I may. Okay, thank you. When people come to you for help, I mean, in the world of organizational support, design management, like there's so many options, right? So who are you finding is interested in regenerative solutions? And are a lot of people interested, or are we still kind of socially in a phase of a lot of education around this? And then are people coming to you being like, yes, we want regenerative models, we get it? Or is it more like you're just sort of a solution resource, and then you kind of plug this new perspective and way in? Like the temperature of the now is kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think it's really coming from all sorts of spaces, and contextually, we're able to really meet people in those spaces. For some, it is more just at the kind of the learning end of things, right? A complete rethinking. And then some are really more already aligned to ideas around regeneration and viewing an organization as a living system. And so we're able to begin operationalizing that with them. I think sometimes even where we are asked to just kind of jump into more operational approaches, and we're able to kind of come at it from that other direction of here's how we would operationally look at it, and then the education process comes through that. So in terms of sectors of business, really all over the map, is who we're working with. It really comes down to, I think, a desire to begin, I would say almost an exhaustion and a desire, right? An exhaustion with the way things have been, and really believing that a living systems approach, or at least considering organizational health, is probably the direction to be going.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that the conversation, this idea of regeneration, is coming from everywhere, but is still relatively new. And the immediate, the industry that's really embracing this proactively is food and agriculture. So you're seeing a lot of people, and I would say that's still 50, 60% of the work we do is in that space. And the rest of it is really equally divided in every industry you can imagine. But when you're already, quote unquote, managing a living system like land or soil or food, they can easily make the connection to some of those concepts in a way that they can really move quicker as a part of this process. But there are other places, like we're doing this with law or family court systems, and where the idea of it resonates, but it's overwhelming to think what all and where all needs to change. And so you have advocates that are really trying to push for it and leading in a way as thought leaders about trying to embrace that. And it's early days. And actually in Rhythm is excited about the fact that we are incredibly committed to bringing regeneration to all industries. We have chosen to make that a priority because we really believe that shifts policy, it shifts community, it shifts all kinds of things versus it getting segmented and siloed, which is the design of a machine. So
Yeah, just to give some examples outside of the food and agriculture space as well. These principles and framework are being used currently in community dynamics to rethink how entire villages are coming together. This is being used in network dynamics. We have members of our community of practice who are designing educational systems around it. So even getting into other design spaces like architecture and running architecture firms, these are all spaces too that it is really being looked at and accepted and enjoyed.
Can I ask one question? It's related to the resiliency in the regenerative framework. Like I'm coming from like the tech background in which during like the COVID time when the things were moving online, so there were like a lot of businesses which were like running offline. They wanted to like move online, so I was like creating those like online systems for them that can help them like thrive or pass through these difficult times. So like my thing of like you're building resiliency was like how you can like like change or like transfer according to the situation what is happening. So in terms of like the regenerative or resiliency, what pieces this kind of like resiliency would be missing, where like we can apply that regenerative framework in developing that resiliency similar to the living system.
Yeah, when we're talking about resiliency, for us, it's very tied to diversity, and being able to have diversity of voices in decision making, and also ties greatly into principles like nodalism. When we have common purpose, and we are empowering unique voices, another one of principles, and they are empowered in a way where they are able to contribute and be decision makers and contributors, what you end up finding is that you have less of these siloed conversations, and you have less dependencies on what, in a machine design would be considered a single point of failure, right? What you end up with is multiple team members who are able to see solutions, who are empowered to make solutions, and that really allows for greater resiliency through challenges that come, because it doesn't rely on just one person or one process, right? So I don't know if that speaks to it, but we see those two as very tied: resiliency and diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like building like different point of contact. So if because of situation like one stops functioning, then there's another that can take over those processes.
Yeah, and it sounds nice, but I mean, if you think about the organizations you've worked in, all that actually goes into making that work, right? Like if the principle of developmental hasn't really been honored, then you only have a handful of resources within your organization, handful of people who can actually do X, Y, and Z, right? And so if there aren't developmental opportunities across the board, then you will always find these challenges that you're not very resilient in them, because there haven't been those developmental opportunities to empower decision makers.
Yeah. Thank you for the answer.
Alrighty. Well, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I know that we're 2 minutes over, so I think we'll start wrapping up really quickly. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I popped a link in the chat about, we do have a design lab coming up in January, on January 10th. Basically, that's an opportunity. If any of this appeals to you, if any of this appeals to you and you want to explore more of the regenerative framework, more of the living systems patterns, a great way to do so and apply that directly to something in your life. It could be your role, it could be an organization that you're forming, any project that you have in mind. This is a great workshop space to go through the framework. And I will also leave my email in the chat. If you have any questions on any of the programs or any of our offerings, I'm happy to answer any questions for you. And if you want to revisit these slides or revisit this conversation, a recording will be going out shortly. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.